228 people. Atlantic Ocean. 2 a.m. Both autopilots died without any warning. 3 pilots panicked. Wrong decisions. Plane started falling. One woman in seat 19A knew exactly how to save everyone. She had the knowledge. She had the skills. But she was asleep. And nobody woke her. 228 vanished forever. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 44 years old. She had short dark hair and tired eyes. She was sitting in seat 19A on board Atlas Air Flight 901, flying from London to New York over the Atlantic Ocean. The flight had taken off at 10 p.m. Most passengers were already asleep. Elena was asleep too. Nobody paid any attention to Elena. She looked like any ordinary passenger. She wore a dark blue jacket and gray trousers. A small pillow was pressed against the window. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was slow and deep. She had been awake for 20 hours before this flight. She had fallen asleep before the plane even crossed the coast of England. What nobody on that plane knew was that Elena Vasquez had spent 15 years as a lead autopilot systems engineer. She had designed and tested autopilot computers for large commercial aircraft. She knew every warning signal. She knew every failure mode. She had personally identified a rare but deadly autopilot glitch called a silent cascade failure, a fault where the autopilot disconnects without any alarm, and the backup system also fails silently at the same time. She had written a full report about it 5 years ago. She had warned that it could happen on certain aircraft flying long routes over oceans at night. The airline had received her report. They had filed it away. No changes were made. At 1:47 in the morning, for hours into the flight, while the cabin was dark and almost everyone was sleeping, the autopilot on Atlas Air Flight 901 died. Not with a warning. Not with an alarm. It simply went off, silently, just as Elena had warned it could. The backup system tried to take over. The backup system also failed. The plane began drifting slowly to the left at 39,000 feet over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Captain David Cole was 51 years old. He had 18,000 flying hours. He was an experienced and respected pilot. But tonight, Captain Cole was in the crew rest area. He had handed control to First Officer Sam Park, who was 33, and Second Officer Ryan Holt, who was 27. Both men were qualified. Both men were awake. But both men were looking at their screens when the autopilot failed. They did not notice for 3 full minutes. When First Officer Park finally looked at the attitude indicator, his stomach dropped. The plane had rolled 7 degrees to the left. The nose had dropped slightly. They were descending at 400 feet per minute. They had lost almost 1,200 feet without realizing it. Park grabbed the controls. He corrected too fast. The plane rolled to the right. Holt called for Captain Cole on the interphone. Cole came running from the rest area within 30 seconds. What Cole saw when he entered the cockpit frightened him. Both autopilot systems were showing fail. The flight management computer was giving error codes he had never seen in real flight. The plane was yawing right, then left, as Park struggled to keep it level. The altitude was dropping. They were at 37,200 feet and still going down. Cole took the controls. He tried to stabilize. But the aircraft was not responding correctly. The control surfaces were delayed. The rudder inputs were weak. There was a lag between what Cole commanded and what the aircraft did. Something deeper was wrong, something beyond a simple autopilot failure. This was the silent cascade failure. The same failure Elena Vasquez had documented years ago. When it occurred, it did not just disconnect the autopilot. It corrupted the control surface trim system as well. The elevators were slightly misaligned. Every correction the pilots made was being partially cancelled by the corrupted trim. The harder they worked, the more energy they wasted. The plane kept descending. Cole called the other officers. All three men were now at the controls together, trying different combinations. They pulled up the emergency checklist. The checklist had no entry for this failure because the airline had never added Elena's warning to its procedures. The altitude fell through 34,000 feet. Then 31,000. Then 28,000. At 28,000 feet the aircraft entered a Dutch roll, a dangerous combination of rolling and yawing that, if not stopped, would tear the plane apart or send it into an unrecoverable spin. The cabin oxygen masks dropped. Passengers woke up screaming. The plane was shaking violently. Bags fell from overhead bins. A child in row 12 was crying so loudly the sound carried to the back of the aircraft. A senior flight attendant named Grace Chen picked up the cabin PA system. Her hands were shaking. She spoke into the microphone. "Attention passengers. If there is anyone on board with aviation engineering experience, please press your call button now. This is urgent. Any aviation professional, please identify yourself immediately." In seat 19A, the announcement cut through Elena's sleep. She opened her eyes. For 2 full seconds she did not understand what was happening. Then she felt the aircraft moving wrongly beneath her. The shaking. The wrong angle. The drop. Her body knew before her mind did. She pressed her call button. Grace reached her in moments. "I have aviation engineering experience," Elena said. "Autopilot systems." "What aircraft type is this?" Grace told her the aircraft model and series number. Elena felt cold. She recognized it. She stood up immediately. "Take me to the cockpit. Right now. Please." Grace ran with her to the cockpit door and knocked hard. Cole opened it. Elena stepped inside and looked at the instrument panel. She saw the failure codes. She saw the trim misalignment. She saw the Dutch roll developing in the attitude indicator. She knew exactly what it was. She had seen it in simulation. She had written about it. She had warned about it. She also knew something else. She knew that by the time a silent cascade failure reached this stage, corrupted trim combined with Dutch roll at this altitude and speed, there was only one recovery procedure. It required shutting down both flight control computers completely, switching to direct mechanical control, and manually resetting the trim before restarting. The process took 4 minutes if done perfectly. 4 minutes of direct manual control with no computer assistance, no autopilot, no trim correction. 4 minutes was a very long time in a Dutch roll at 26,000 feet over the ocean at night. She told Captain Cole everything in 30 seconds. He listened. He understood. He looked at her for one moment. "Can you walk us through it step by step?" he asked. "Yes," Elena said. "I can." She began. The first step went correctly. Cole shut down flight control computer 1 on her instruction. The Dutch roll reduced slightly. The plane was still shaking but the motion was becoming more regular. Holt read back the values from the trim indicator as Elena called them out. The second step went correctly. Cole shut down flight control computer 2. Now they were on direct mechanical control only. The aircraft was heavy in the hands. Enormous physical effort was needed to hold the wings level. Cole and Park both held the controls together. The plane steadied slightly. Elena moved to the trim panel. She began the reset sequence, a precise series of inputs in a specific order. She had memorized this sequence. She had practiced it in simulators when writing her original report. She got through the first 8 inputs correctly. On the 9th input, the aircraft hit severe clear air turbulence. The plane dropped 200 feet in less than 2 seconds. Elena was thrown backward. She hit the cockpit door frame hard with her shoulder. The trim panel input she was making was disrupted mid-sequence. The trim system received a partial and incorrect command. The elevators locked. Not failed. Locked. Jammed in a nose-down position by the corrupted partial input combined with the turbulence force on the control surfaces. Cole pulled back on the controls with everything he had. Park pulled back beside him. The yoke would not move. The nose stayed down. The aircraft began to accelerate in a steep dive. Elena pulled herself back to the panel. She could see what had happened. She knew the only remaining option, a full hydraulic reset, which would take 6 minutes and required the aircraft to be in stable level flight first. They were not in stable level flight. They were in a dive. There was no procedure left. The altitude was 19,000 feet. The dive angle was 22 degrees nose down. The speed was building past the aircraft's maximum operating speed. The airframe was beginning to shake with a different kind of vibration, the vibration of metal approaching its structural limits. In the cabin, passengers knew. There are moments in disasters when people understand what is happening without being told. This was one of those moments. People were holding their children. People were holding strangers. People were on their phones. People were praying. Captain Cole spoke over the PA. His voice was steady. He was a professional until the very last second. This is Captain Cole. I need everyone to brace right now. Brace position. Hands over your head. Heads down. Do it now. Elena was still at the panel. She was still trying. She was entering override codes that had no basis in any manual, combinations she was inventing from first principles in real time, trying to find any electrical pathway that could release the elevator lock. Her fingers were moving fast. Her mind was completely clear. She was not panicking. She was working. She found a partial release at 11,000 feet. The elevator freed by 3 degrees. Not enough. The dive angle reduced from 22 degrees to 19. The speed stopped increasing. It was not enough. Atlas Air Flight 901 hit the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at 11,000 feet per minute, approximately 340 miles east of the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, at 2:31 in the morning. The impact was instantaneous. All 228 people on board, 211 passengers and 17 crew, were gone. Search and rescue teams from Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom reached the debris field 6 hours later. The ocean at that location was 3,200 meters deep. The wreckage was spread across 4 square kilometers of the surface. There were no survivors. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder were recovered 11 weeks later from the ocean floor. Investigators listened to the final minutes of the flight. They heard Captain Cole giving instructions. They heard First Officer Park reading out altitude. They heard Second Officer Holt calling speeds. And they heard a woman's voice, calm, fast, precise, calling out trim codes and override sequences until the very last second. The investigation report identified the cause as a silent cascade autopilot failure combined with trim system corruption following an uncontrolled control surface input during turbulence. The report noted that this specific failure mode had been documented in a safety warning submitted to the airline 5 years earlier by an engineer named Elena Vasquez. The warning had not been incorporated into emergency procedures. It had not been added to pilot training. No aircraft modification had been made. The report's final paragraph read as follows. Elena Vasquez identified this failure mode years before it occurred. She warned that it was possible. She provided a recovery procedure. That procedure was not adopted. On the night of the accident, Elena Vasquez was aboard the flight as a passenger. When the failure occurred, she identified it immediately. She provided correct guidance to the flight crew. She attempted the recovery procedure under extreme conditions. She continued working until impact. The accident was not caused by a failure of knowledge. It was caused by a failure to act on knowledge that already existed. The report recommended immediate mandatory updates to emergency procedures for all aircraft of this type worldwide. It recommended that safety warnings submitted by engineers be reviewed within 60 days of submission and either adopted or formally rejected with written reasons. It recommended that the failure mode be added to all simulator training programs. All recommendations were adopted within 1 year. But the 228 people on Flight 901 were already gone. Elena Vasquez was gone. The Atlantic Ocean kept its silence, as it always does, as it always will. In London, a man named Thomas Vasquez received a phone call at 4 a.m. He was Elena's husband. He had 3 children with her. The youngest was 6 years old. When the investigator finished speaking, Thomas sat down on the kitchen floor and did not move for a long time. In New York, families who had been waiting at the arrivals gate slowly understood that the boards were never going to update. That the flight was never going to land. That the people they were waiting for were not coming. 228 names. 228 people who had packed their bags, checked in, found their seats, buckled their belts, and trusted that the sky would carry them safely from one side of the ocean to the other. They trusted the sky. The sky did not keep its promise that night. And a woman who had tried to warn the world, who had known what could happen, who had fought until the very last second to stop it, she went down with them. Some warnings are heard too late. Some knowledge arrives exactly when it is needed, but the door is already closed. Some people spend their lives trying to prevent the thing that kills them in the end. That is the story of Flight 901. That is the story of 228 people who vanished over the Atlantic in the middle of the night. That is the story of Elena Vasquez, who was asleep when it started, who woke up and tried with everything she had, and whose trying was not enough. Remember their names. All 228 of them. They deserve to be remembered.